So since I have to give this a YouTube title, I'm going to title it, What Can Judaism Teach Catholics? Or what can Catholics learn from Judaism? And of course, in answer to the question, what can Catholics learn from Judaism, I don't mean that there's some Judeo-Christian tradition, quote unquote, and that we have to look to our elder brothers in the faith, quote unquote. I don't mean any of that. What I mean is look to the history of the development of Judaism, and you will see, I think, that this divide between traditionalists and modernists doesn't go away merely because you dress up a form of modernism to look more traditional. That's the fundamental point. A couple of the comments seem to me to be quite interesting. I want to thank Stumped 11. And the portion that I find the most intriguing comes in the middle of this response, talking about Harrison Butker's, quote, softer form of traditionalism. Stumped 11 says, quote, I think this is how the council will come to its true implementation. Someday we will probably get an edition of the Novus-Ordo, which blends the TLM while retaining two distinct forms, end quote. Now, to the extent that I understand the comment, let me just say two things. Firstly, whether you think this kind of middle-of-the-road option is going to solve things or not for the Catholic Church, I think depends partially on what you think the problem is. On the one hand, there are people who think that the problem is, I'm going to say, superficial or liturgical. And in virtue of saying that, I don't mean to diminish the problems for people who take this kind of approach, but I do mean that they think that the problems lie on the surface. It's kind of the distinction I'm kind of getting at. And here's what I mean. There's a sizable subset of Catholics who say something like this about the Novus-Ordo, that it can be celebrated without proper reverence, that maybe it's too loosey-goosey, that priests have too much latitude to just sort of change the rubrics, or that the directors of religious education and so on have too much latitude to change things, that the priest can just sort of step out of being the president of the assembly and can address the crowd, and there's little asides, and you can have the priest pacing around through the congregation and so on. And some people just think that that's a little bit too free-form, not respectful enough, and so on. But if you think that, then you might also think that there's an easy solution. You just tighten up the screws on the Novus-Ordo. That's where maybe you can get a little bit of impetus for this kind of hybrid version of the Mass, where maybe you just borrow some Latin phrases from the traditional Latin Mass, you add a few genuflections, maybe you restrict the announcement portion to after the concluding rites are over, or whatever it is that you think is the problem with the Novus-Ordo. If it's at the level of surface, superficial level of liturgy is what I'm getting at, and you can change it just by doing what they did in the 1960s at the Concilium. You can change the liturgy again. Now, on the other hand, there are some people who think that the problems are much deeper seated than that, that they're core issues. And for lack of a better word, we'll say that they turn on theology. And I thought I got into this just a little bit in the video, mentioned it, namely when Father Cicada, for example, references the difference between assembly theology, which he says underlies the new Mass, and the prior theology developed over a long period of time that underlay the traditional Latin Mass. Now, if you think the problems are theological, then you cannot modify the Novus-Ordo in any way that would be acceptable to a traditionalist, because the Novus-Ordo itself represents a modernist departure from the true theology of the Church. Now, to try to get a handle on that, maybe, or get a little deeper insight into what's being alleged, it is helpful, I think, to take a case study. And actually, believe it or not, you can look at Judaism as it has developed historically, especially since roughly the 18th century. And let me say as a caveat, this is not intended to be a full historical discussion of the history of Judaism. So I'm going to ignore quite a lot, and I'm just going to make a very rough summary that I think captures the spirit of what has happened in Judaism. So if you go back, say, to the 16th century and earlier, the Jews lived in isolated communities. They had no real intercourse with whatever culture they were embedded in. The rabbis controlled each little Jewish community. They had very strict rules, they had very strict dress, and so on. Everything was highly regimented. After the Enlightenment started to penetrate Jewish circles, and this in Jewish context is sometimes called the Haskalah or the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. One of the first religious fruits from this Enlightenment was what is called Reform Judaism. Now, Reform Judaism started to intermingle men and women in the congregation. It employed the vernacular. It started in a way to integrate and encourage the integration of Jews into the wider life of whatever culture they were embedded in, and basically true to modernist form, it started to incorporate historical, critical scholarship into an exploration of things like the Tanakh, or that is the Old Testament, or to a certain extent into the Talmudic corpus as well, and other writings that are important in Judaism. Once that initial reaction took place from traditionalism to Reform Judaism, there was a separate reaction, a counter-reaction that took place, and that is what created the modern Orthodox Jews. Modern Orthodox Jews are those Jews who basically want to have something to do with modern life, with culture. They think the Reform Jews went too far, and they have reinstituted, for example, some kind of segregation in their synagogue worship. Sometimes they go back to Hebrew readings, and they have various things that differentiate them, but they haven't gone all the way back to traditionalism. Today, if you want to think about truly traditional Jews, they're often called ultra-Orthodox, and the specific reference there is to the fact that they're not modern in any way. They self-impose segregation on themselves and often live voluntarily in isolated communities. They retain their distinctive dress. The males wear side locks. Then even between the modern Orthodox and the Reform, you got an attempt to create a middle of the road even there, which was the conservative movement. And this really hasn't debated. There are other sorts of Judaism, which are marginal to one degree or other, that have tried to intermediate between the various types. And the point that I'm making is, if you look at the history of Judaism, I think you can see quite clearly that no middle-of-the-road option will satisfy everyone. It's not the case that the modern Orthodox won over the hearts and minds of Jewish people, for example, when Reform Judaism, in their opinion, went too far, as maybe today some conservative Catholics think about the Novus-Ordo. At the same time, the modern Orthodox weren't compelled to go all the way back the way things were and become full-out traditionalists. And yet that option, the modern Orthodox option, wasn't especially attractive to some people who then created the conservative movement. So I think what this shows is two things. The first thing is that the historical progression in Judaism, in Protestantism, and I think it's shaping up this way in Catholicism, is simply a push towards some kind of almost a pluralism, where short of a Vatican that really does impose limits on what it means to be Catholic, and maybe I'll leave that for another time to explore, you're just going to have an explosion of different types. And I don't think that this hypothesized hybrid model, which the poster mentions, maybe returning Ember Days or whatever, I just don't think that that's going to have a very broad impact the way that the poster seems to suppose. And the second thing is that the major difference, I think, in Catholicism today in various strands, as well as in Judaism, is the difference between the modernists and the traditionalists or the pre-modernists. In the Jewish context, that would be the ultra-Orthodox, basically, versus everyone else. And that is not to say that the ultra-Orthodox are a monolithic institution. They're not. There's a variation there. But the main difference is with respect to how much engagement there should be with the modern world, what's the approach to what they regard as sacred scripture, what is the extent to which modern science, or Enlightenment science, mechanical science, however you want to put it, how much should that be grappled with by a religious person, and so on. And so on the modernist side, you do have this wide variation in terms of how much liturgical reform or not reform they want to include, and that's where you get this dizzying array of styles. And that's, I think, what you're seeing in Catholicism when you've got conservative Novus-Ordos on one hand, you've got liberals on the other, and maybe a middle-of-the-road option is going to appeal to some people on the modernist side. But there are some traditionalists, I think, who are really calling for a return to pre-modern sensibilities. And that is not going to be assuaged by some kind of hybrid. That is just going to be seen as another modernist innovation. There are certain traditionalists who will not be satisfied with anything but an embrace, a return, however you want to put it, to the traditional Latin Mass with no innovation. So once again, in summation, what can Catholics learn from Judaism? I think we can learn from the history of Judaism that this reaction to traditionalism that issues in a very liberal kind of trajectory will inevitably cause a reaction which is seemingly more traditional but still is fueled by this modernist impulse or underlying modernist assumptions. And so I think it is simply wrong-headed to think that an intermediate Novus-Ordo TLM Mass is somehow going to reconcile all of the differences that are in play. It's just not going to happen. You can just look at what's happening in the church and ask yourself whether you think that that is going to be reconciled by some middle-of-the-road option, or whether you think that Catholics are going to go and travel the same path that Jews traveled already. And we again have a case study of this. The history of Judaism, I think, shows quite clearly that this fundamental fissure between traditionalists or pre-modernists and modernists is certainly unaffected by having a version of modernism that is more traditional looking. And of course in Judaism that's called orthodoxy, and in Catholicism basically sometimes that's called conservatism, but conservatives like Bishop Barron are now starting to use the term traditional, and this is where things get extremely confusing. They were confusing already. So I hope to explore these themes further in upcoming videos.